All right, folks, time to get started with our second panel. So get yourselves comfortable, and I'd like to invite Dagny, Jessika, Matthew, and Rachel to the stage. Let's give them a round of applause. The title of this panel is Burning Questions: How Fire Impacts Southwestern Forests, Flora and Fauna. Just hang tight as we get your presentation queued up.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to talk to you about fire today. I'm Jess. I'm here with Dagny, Rachel, and Matt. And yeah, we're all MSc employed students and talking about some of our thesis research. And I've never used a clicker before, so let's see. Cool. So just a little bit of an introduction. I know fire can sometimes be a sensitive topic, especially in a state like Colorado. Sometimes can be a little sensitive, if not scary. But it's important to note that fire is a fundamental ecological and evolutionary process. Ecosystems around the world have evolved with fire. We can see that through fire-scarred tree rings that Dagny's going to talk to you about, also some fire-adapted plant species. And fire has particularly shaped the Southwest since millennia. Additionally, it's important to note that the indigenous people of the Southwestern United States have stewarded these landscapes with fire since time immemorial. And while I would love to unpack all of the amazing ways that the indigenous people of this region have impacted local fire regimes and really stewarded these lands through cultural burning, we don't have enough time today, but wanted to pay homage to the huge diversity of cultures that have made this region what it is. So unfortunately, the combination of climate change and land management legacies have really changed our fire regimes in the Southwest. Essentially, this kind of boils down to warmer, drier conditions combined with intense fuel loads that are kind of being more conducive to novel wildfire behavior. And these changes have really unique consequences for Southwestern ecosystems.
All right. So, yeah, we're going to be exploring the complex role of fire regimes and their historical impact in the Rocky Mountains. The Rockies experience varied fire activities due to differences in elevation, species, vegetation, and climate. These range from frequent low-intensity fires essential for maintaining forest health to rare high-intensity fires that dramatically transform the landscape. For instance, Engelmann spruce, adapted to the Rockies' cooler, high-altitude environments, benefits from fires that reduce competition. Similarly, aspen exhibits remarkable resilience, rapidly regenerating post-fire to stabilize soil and promote biodiversity through ecological succession. These species underscore the intricate, often positive impacts of fire on forest health and biodiversity, yet human actions and climate change are intensifying these fires, altering their natural patterns with significant ecological consequences.
Okay, so as a consequence, when we're observing these changing fire regimes, they're producing a variety of effects. So we're seeing increases in things like fire season length, fuel flammability, and extreme fire weather that are then conducive to increases in the number of large fires we're seeing, annual area burned, and in some areas, burn severity. And so this kind of amalgamation of factors is increasingly conducive for extreme fire spread events. And so we can kind of see this either photos during and post the East Troublesome Fire here in Colorado that happened in 2020. And it's important to note that these events in particular are kind of surpassing the historical range of variability, also surpassing contemporary management strategies like fire suppression, and are really inherently jeopardizing forest resilience in certain areas.
So with an increase in fire severity and occurrence, we are going to have winners and losers, of course. And so certain forest types may struggle to survive, where others may actually thrive. An example of this that we are already seeing is lower elevation ponderosa pine forests having limited regenerative success due to new microclimatic conditions, limited refugia, etc. Other tree species are more adept to these more severe fires, such as the lodgepole pine, with serotinous cones necessitating high-intensity crown fires for their seeds to be spread and for their regeneration generally. There are other species that may actually thrive in a landscape with more disturbance, such as aspen, in which disturbance allows them to more prolifically propagate, and these species may become more abundant. This is due to a range of complex adaptations that many of these species have to fire, some being more adept to these higher levels of severity, whereas others are adept to low severity regimes, and these regime shifts changing how these species survive and thrive.
All right, so just to give you an example of what it might look like in a forested system that is struggling to survive under modern fire regimes. So increasingly in the Western United States, we're seeing this occurrence of what we call type conversion. And this has to do with the interplay of climate and also land use legacies, like Jess mentioned. And so type conversion occurs when a system's resistance to change, as well as its resilience to return to that pre-disturbance state, are overcome. And so I have a little example for you here. So imagine you have a fire adapted system and it catches on fire. If that forest does tend to burn, then you'll see its resistance to that disturbance event overcome. Now, we might see a return to that pre-disturbance state, and that's an example of the resilience of that system being intact. However, there are other factors like hotter and drier post-fire environments and repeat fires that would affect the same area that might facilitate this example of type conversion. And so in this case, we might see a shift from a forested area to a grassland, for example. And so this kind of brings us back to our main kind of overarching theme here that you'll see in all of our presentations. And that comes back to the question of what impacts do contemporary fires hold for Southwestern forests, flora and fauna. And with that, I'll hand it off to Greg.
All right, so the name of my project is Reconstructing Temporal and Spatial Patterns of Wildfire Along an Elevational Gradient of the Calf Creek Plateau, Colorado, using dendroecology and remote sensing. So yeah, the objective of my study was to determine historical fire regimes of the Calf Creek Plateau by mapping recent and historical fire boundaries, utilizing remote sensing applications, and reconstructing fire regimes through dendroecology. Okay, so the first year that I structured my field work, I used LiDAR data to create a canopy height model, and then I stratified different layers based on the biggest differences in canopy height and sampled based on the canopy height. That'll come into play later. The second year that I took field data, I used the supervised classification to classify the forest types in my study area by 4 different strata. So as you see here, the first is aspen. That's the yellow part. Basically, I used I did the supervised classification by drawing polygons around each forest class, and that told the machine learning algorithm in the GIS program what was what. So yeah, so anyways, aspen is yellow. And then the light green is low elevation open conifer. That's like ponderosa pine. And then the darker green, but not the darkest green, is upper elevation open conifer. So think Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, but not as in dense of stands as in the continuous dense conifer class. And so that's what informed my field sampling for the second year. And then to get an accuracy of that, I did a ground truthing using ArcGIS Quick Capture, took 342 points. I classified aspen right about 68% of the time. And then the other conifer classes I classified like 88 to 93%. Right. Cool. So yeah, we did a lot of field work over those first 2 years and then processed it in a multitude of ways, but one of them was in Western's wood shop using the bandsaw, which is kind of a formidable object. So that's there on the left. Basically, you have to put the samples through these fire scars. So on the right, those are fire scars. And then on the left, that's the bandsaw. So you put the samples through to get as flat of a surface as possible to date. So I did bring some of them here. But yeah, so that's what like the final output looks like. And then I just think this picture is cool because it shows you what wood looks like under a microscope. So this is wood cells. And wood grows right from the summer into the winter. The light cells are the early wood, right? And then it goes into the late wood because it stops growing in the winter. This is just what the canopy height model looked like. So we have canopy heights in my study area, obviously from the ground up to like 46 meters. I think the highest that I classified was 26 meters. So that's like 130 feet of tall trees. And then this was a canopy density calculation. So I just got the canopy density of the study area, which will also come into play a little bit later. Okay, cool. So this was the average age of my study area, and the each number is the plot. So the average age of that plot. So over there on the right corner, 90, that was a ponderosa pine plot. Let's see, up in the right corner, 109 average age for that was an aspen stand mostly up there. And then what we're really interested in looking at is that 244, like this area is really interesting because that's like a dense conifer area. So these trees in that area specifically, like the average age for this stand was 244 years. I also got like a maximum age. And let me back up a little bit. So the way that I got the age was based on all of the tree cores that we took. So we took 650 tree cores over the course of 2 years that we analyzed in this program called Q Recorder. And those, I have those too. So this is what they look like. So I don't want to downplay, but I had like dozens of people help me analyze all these tree cores in Q Recorder. Nate Gore's ENVS 400 class. And I also had Jonathan Coop's class, Mountains and Rivers course helped me in the field. So anyways, but that all of that data went into what this map is. So yeah, so maximum age. So we're looking over at that ponderosa pine forest, that low elevation open conifer that's 230 years old. We have the continuous dense conifer class over here. That's the oldest tree over there was 354 years. And some high elevation open conifer is at this blue area. So those trees aren't as old. And basically the conclusions from that are fire hasn't been experienced in these really old stands in a long time, right? That's leading to these really dense dense tree canopies. And then, but there has been some fire in the upper elevation. So in these blue areas, there was fire, you know, sometime in the last 120 years-ish. Yeah. And then same with ponderosa pine, like the low elevation open conifer, like those ponderos can be really old. That one over here was 314 years old. That was a ponderosa. But the fire that goes through stands like that is more low severity. Yeah, so anyways, because of how massive the undertaking of this project was, not everything is finished yet. But I just wanted to show you guys kind of what the results so far are looking like. And this project was done in conjunction with the Bureau of Land Management and obviously Western. So yeah. I got questions.
Well done. That is so interesting. So I would encourage folks in the audience or online to go ahead and submit questions through our app. Now is the time. While we're waiting for those to come in, I think I'll pose a question. Can you describe the frequency of your field work and the level of effort that went into that and some of the folks that you had involved? I know you alluded to a couple classes, but I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the first year I did field work with Lauren Hirsch, and that was also through the Bureau of Land Management. We didn't have as much help as I had with Kate Harvey the second year. Kate Harvey graduated last year out of this program. And let's see, I also had a bunch of the fuels crew from the BLM help me. So there were students like Amy Meyer, Andre Villa, let's see, there's a bunch of students. Alden helped a bunch. So yeah, so that actually ended up being one of my favorite parts of this project. I thought that getting to use a chainsaw was going to be my favorite part of this project, but it actually ended up being able to work with all the students that were so stoked to work with trees.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions now. We'll get to one of these and then we'll save the rest for a little bit later.
Yeah.
Did you locate any invasive trees in your field work?
Oh, that's a good question. The only trees I encountered were Engelmann spruce, Salvapan fir, aspen, ponderosa pine, some lodgepole pine. So no invasives, but that's a good question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We're going to move on to our next speaker and we'll reserve these other questions for our panel Q&A.
All right. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to y'all about extreme fire spread events and how they jeopardize forest resilience in the Southwestern United States. So if you have read the news at all in the last few years, you've probably seen record-breaking headlines about extreme wildfires all around the world. Canada, Australia, California, even here in Colorado in 2020, we're seeing an increase in these extreme events that have major consequences for both our communities and our ecosystems. So an extreme fire spread event can kind of be boiled down to having a very high fire intensity and very rapid fire spread rates, where these events are essentially consuming a lot of area burned with significant consequences. Globally, these events are linked to climate change impacts, some of which we've already attested to in the presentation, but warmer, drier conditions, drying out fuels, producing novel weather patterns are really kind of fueling some of these events around the world. And these events have long-term impacts to our ecosystems, as you might be able to guess. So we'll get into that. It's really important to distinguish in this project between an extreme wildfire, generally speaking, and these extreme single-day fire spread events. So when we talk about an extreme single-day fire spread event, we're kind of just thinking about the amount of area burned per day and kind of gives us some really interesting input into how this fire's behavior is rolling out on the landscape. A really great example of this that I'll touch on throughout this presentation is the East Troublesome Fire that happened here in Colorado in 2020 that consumed over 100,000 acres in a single day, which was pretty insane considering our previous record-breaking fire, the 2002 Hayman fire before 2020, had consumed maybe like 143,000 acres overall. So yeah, really important to kind of understand how these fires are really playing out on the landscape. And these extreme single-day events have constituted about 70% of area burned in fire-prone ecoregions of the West over the last 2 decades. So they're really also kind of like consuming most of our area, and we want to know what's going on with that. These events are also increasing with climate change and are projected to escalate in the future. So really important study matter. And so what we really want to understand is what are the post-fire landscape effects of these extreme single-day fire spread events and how they might impact forest resilience. A great way to measure this is thinking about burn severity, which is essentially the above and below ground organic matter consumed by wildfire. And although there's a bunch of ways that we can measure burn severity, it's typically kind of ranked on a scale from unburned, thanks Matt, for moving away from my unburned section. We go kind of from unburned to low to moderate to high severity. And this photo kind of illustrates maybe what that would look like on the landscape. It's also important to note that heterogeneity in burn severity patterning is really important for ecosystem functions. However, area burned at high severity, so this kind of right-hand side right there where there's like nothing that survived apparently, is increasing with climate change. And so it's a really pertinent matter that we kind of need to address in terms of thinking about long-term ecosystem longevity. Another really important thing to think about when we talk about burn severity is the pattern in which these fires are burning and implicating post-fire on the landscape. So some really cool research coming out of the University of Washington looks at these high severity patches. And essentially, these are high severity areas that are, taking up either a lot of area or a little area, depending on the homogeneity or heterogeneity of these patches. And this research in particular found that patch size in patch core area increased with area burned. So larger fires are producing larger patches. Seems kind of intuitive. But the really big implications here is that the larger a patch is, and the more core area, as you can see kind of on that left-hand patch right there, the greater distance we're getting from the nearest live seed source for natural regeneration after the fire. And so if you're a visual learner like me, that might look something like this on the landscape. So on the left here, we have this big, homogeneous, high severity patch that's probably going to take decades, if not centuries, to recover, if it recovers at all under the threats of climate change. Whereas, these other configurations might have a little bit better of a chance because there's more live seed sources to potentially regenerate these areas. And it's also important to note here in the Southwest that the threshold for regeneration failure is about 50 to 100 meters. So not a lot of area. So the major guiding question for this research has been, are these extreme fire spread events driving abnormal burn severity and landscape patterns on the landscape? And what does that mean for the future of our forests? Our study area comprised the Southwestern United States. We specifically focused on forested mountainous ecoregions from 2002 to 2020. And we selected for fires that were greater than 400 hectares to constitute a large fire. We've kind of already attested to this, but there's a huge diversity of forest types and fire regimes in the Southwest, ranging from this lower elevation, frequent low severity ponderosa pine system up to the subalpine spruce fir zone that might have infrequent stand replacing fire. And again, the Southwest is acclimated to fire, including high severity, infrequent fire. However, we're seeing an increase in that with climate change, kind of surpassing this historical range of variability. So what this research ultimately hinges on are these day of burning maps where we can quantify daily area burned to kind of understand then what are the impacts of extreme events compared to maybe more mild spread events. So I won't get too into the weeds with these methods, but essentially what we do is we take hotspot detection data from satellite imagery from space and can kind of interpolate around these hotspots that we know are happening on certain days to overall quantify daily area burned. And then we can kind of further categorize daily area burned with common, large, and extreme spread rates. And we did this using like 1 to 2 standard deviations, mean plus 1 to 2 standard deviations of our data set. And so our extreme threshold in this case is about 4,900 hectares per day or greater. And so this is a day of burning map from the East Troublesome Fire, kind of illustrating that huge 100,000 acre run. And I'll be using that as an example throughout. So then when we think about burn severity, we use something called the composite burn index. It's on a scale of 0 to 3 continuously, kind of thinking about 0 is unburned, and then 3 would be maximum high severity. And then we essentially kind of go a step further and isolate these indices into high severity patches with this CBI value of 2.25 and above. And this essentially constitutes to 90% or more stand replacing fire where most of the tree vegetation is killed. So then we wanted to figure out kind of like characteristics of these high severity patches and these high severity areas to understand really what we can kind of estimate for forest resilience in the future. So we ran a series of calculations to understand things like continuous burn severity, so that 0 to 3 continuous map that I showed before. We also calculated the proportion of area burned at high severity per day. We looked at the tendency of these high severity areas to aggregate and potentially become more homogeneous. We also looked at the distance to high severity patch edges. So what is the distance to the nearest potential live seed source, kind of on that edge of like an unburned low or moderate severity ranking. And then finally, we also looked at high severity mean patch size and high severity patch total core area to really kind of further characterize the size of these patches and how much area is limited away from being able to naturally regenerate after the fire. So some of our results, just kind of kicking it off, we had about 4 million hectares of forested area burned in our data set from 2002 to 2020. And when you look at this graph, it's kind of segmented into common, large, and extreme spread days. It kind of looks like an even split. However, it's really important to note that out of 633 unique fire events and over 4,300 unique daily fire spread events, this number is attributed to only 140 days in 20 years, essentially, out of about 4,300 days. So while it seems like it's kind of equal visually speaking, only 3% of these days constituted over 35% of area burned, which is pretty remarkable. We also found that under extreme conditions, we had a solid half of area burned at high severity on extreme single day fire spread events compared to common and large events. And so there's a lot here, and I'm not going to totally unpack that. This is only a year and a half of my life and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But essentially, kind of what we're doing here is doing scatter plots and box plots to understand how these landscape metrics relate to daily area burned, and then how they relate to the different extreme, common, and large spread categorizations. And so we found in our research that we had positive relationships between all of our landscape metric values and daily area burned. And we also found that values were a lot higher under extreme conditions compared to those common and large spread days. So for example, our distance from high severity patch interior to patch edges, we had almost twice the average distance from a high severity patch interior to a patch edge, which is pretty remarkable and really just kind of characterizing how important it is to understand these patterns under different fire spread rates. So just to kind of like sum all of that up in a more simple way, extreme fire spread events generated greater continuous burn severity. They created larger proportions of area burned at high severity. And then they're also generating these large homogeneous high severity patches that have increased distances to potential live seed sources through that core area metric and then the distance. And so we can essentially infer a decreased capacity for forest resilience in the Southwest in our future. So some major consequences that come out of this research. Number one, it's important to note that extreme fire spread events and burn severity are both increasing with climate change and are predicted to escalate even further under the future. So really crucial to kind of think about the longevity of our forests in this region, and how they might be threatened over time under increasingly unstable climate. We also want to recognize that with our research results, we found kind of a scaling between these extreme events and burn severity. They're increasing together, and there might be some sort of factors there involved where they might be influenced by similar things like climate or weather or fuels. And so while this necessitates some more research, super stoked to announce that I got a big girl grant just last week to unpack that for my MEM project. So catch me next year talking about that, hopefully. But yeah, just kind of thinking about how these, fire behaviors and post-fire effects might be kind of matching up. Also important to note that extreme events are generating higher burn severity overall that might jeopardize key ecosystem processes, such as carbon sequestration, watershed stability, soil nutrients, wildlife habitat. For example, that 2002 Hayman fire that we were talking about is still seeing significant impacts to watershed health and type conversion, which we're going to get more into later in this presentation. And so those kind of things are projected to take decades to recover. So really important to understand the long-term impacts of these events. And finally, extreme events generate these large homogeneous patches that are inherently going to jeopardize forest resilience. Looking at that photo on the top there, you can imagine just visually that the patch on the left is significantly less likely to rebound to what it once was, not just because of the distance away from its nearest native live seed sources, but also thinking about the fact that under a changing climate, we might see different species such as shrublands or grasslands that are more drought resilient or fire resilient maybe. They might opportunistically colonize a patch like this and kind of outpace the natural trajectory of that ecosystem. Additionally, if we have more homogeneity in these burn severity areas, we might see a reduction in what we call fire refugia, where essentially these little life-saving pockets of trees that didn't get burned in the fire that might serve as seed sources for recovering that patch in the future. So really important to think about management implications here. We're going to have to get creative, like typical fire suppression, not really going to hold up under an extreme event. Also is just a huge danger to our first responders and leaves major impacts on the landscape. So thinking about this through the resist, accept, direct framework, maybe in the future we'll have to resist extreme fire spread and high severity fire by allocating more resources toward fuel mitigation like prescribed burning and mechanical thinning. We may accept that some areas will never recover as these forest types and maybe convert to non-forest vegetation. And then we may direct high severity patch restoration through planting more tolerant species. So in conclusion, we're seeing these events burn more severely. They're generating these large homogeneous patches that are really going to threaten forest resilience. And as these events are projected to increase in the future, we can assume a decreased capacity for forest resilience. I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Jonathan Koop, my committee members, and my funding sources. And I'll take any questions.
Well done, Jess. We have time for one question. Did you find or look for any correlations between burn severity and fuel types?
That's a great question. No, we did not. And that's another exciting thing that I'm interested in exploring over the next year. So this is pretty coarse scale and just looking at these satellite imagery indices, but we really want to tease out what's the difference in these burn severity impacts in vegetation type, or maybe there was some sort of fuel mitigation project that maybe mediates these events, or does fuel density potentially exacerbate these events? So we did not look at that in this project, but hopefully going to explore that in the future.
Wonderful. One more round of applause, and we'll move to our next speaker.
Thank you.
Alrighty, how's it going, everyone? Once again, I am Matthew Harris, and today I'm going to be presenting my thesis work, which is entitled Aspen Impedes Fire Spread in the Southwestern United States. I would like to acknowledge and thank all of my co-authors and the contributors to this research, as well as highlight and emphasize this photo, which we have here, courtesy of Dr. Jonathan Coop, showing a wonderful aspen stand over here on the left side of the screen that did function in this way to stop fire compared to the high severity conifer forest over a high severity burn in the conifer forest over there on the right hand side of the screen. All right, so before jumping into this, let's talk about why aspen may impede fire spread compared to coniferous species. So functionally, a lot of the differences here are due to the differences in morphology, chemistry, as well as moisture between these species. So coniferous forests have more continuous ladder fuels and finer fuels such as their twigs and needles. If you think about your Engelmann spruce forest, where you have a continuous ladder stack of fuels going all the way up, this would allow a surface fire to climb and torch into the crown of these coniferous species, and sometimes that can transition into a running crown fire where we see these high severity fire events occurring. They also have flammable resins in their needles that allow this fire to continue to spread quickly, as well as they have low foliar moisture comparative, allowing them to combust easier. Now, when we're looking at aspens, they have limited ladder fuels. They are self-pruning, so they are dropping their branches as they grow up, which leads to their canopy being held high above the understory, limiting that ability for a fire to climb into the crown. Now, they also have less fine fuels than coniferous species, none of those fine needles, et cetera, and they don't have nearly as many twigs, but their fuels also decompose faster once they hit the forest floor, meaning that there's limited surface fire potential in these forests, and once again, less ability for that fire to spread into the crown. Now, finally, the major difference here is in moisture. They have much higher foliar moisture, which once again does not allow for crown fires to spread in aspen forests unless under certain weather conditions. So what does that actually mean when we're talking fire behavior? Quaking aspen have been referred to as a fire break for decades now, but most of this has been anecdotal. It's been based off observation and seeing this phenomena, but it is yet to be quantified. And one of the main rationale for why this phenomenon may occur is because aspen forests, as you have a running crown fire through conifer forests, when it runs into a continuous aspen stand, that crown fire is no longer held, or at least isn't held for very long in the aspen's foliage, drops to the ground, becomes a creeping ground fire, and often senesces soon afterwards. So what we have seen is that an increase in aspen presence decreases fire occurrence, severity, intensity, etc. And so due to this factor, we wanted to try and quantify and understand how aspen limit fire spread. And we did that through two different means. The first being our question of looking into to what extent does aspen slow fire spread? And the next being to what extent are aspens associated with fire perimeters? Being associated with fire perimeters for us, meaning they likely aided in stopping that fire. And then, of course, the final question being, are these relationships modulated by fire weather, climate, topography, etc.? Before getting into my methodology, I want to emphasize that all of this work was done via remote sensing. And so this is taking spectral indices from hyperspectral satellites, as well as active fire mapping from MODIS and VIRTUS satellites. Over here on the left, we have satellite hotspots. These are hot points on the ground that are sensed for active fire progression. On the left, you have an idea of how these multiple spectral indices are used to understand what kind of land cover type do we have on the ground. So I want to emphasize this is all remote sensing based, and due to that, it necessitates a large amount of data for us to understand or make inferences about landscape scale trends across this region. So my study region is the Four Corners area of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. I also stuck to these forested and mountainous ecoregions, which are shown here in the gray and black polygons. All of those red polygons in this map are the fires that I looked into. I looked into 453 different fires occurring between 2001 and 2020. These were selected for aspen presence, so they had to have at least one pixel of aspen present at some point in our data set for these land covers. My land cover came from Landfire, is an existing vegetation type data set in which we took 77 individual classes of land cover and summed them into these groups that you can see here at the bottom of the slide. The one I will point out distinctly is prior burns. We worked in our own prior burn layer by taking any fire that had occurred within the study region 10 years prior to our fire of interest we were assessing, and denoting any of the land cover it was over as a prior burn to make a distinct effect there. I also got weather metrics from the ERA 5 dataset, topography, etc. So talking about fire spread and those day of burning maps that Jess had mentioned on earlier, that is also what I used following the methods of Sean Parks. And so how those worked are taking those satellite hotspots that I mentioned earlier with that photo, and then interpreting them with the final fire perimeter into a day of burning. And so what we see here in figure A are those actual satellite hotspots colored by the day of fire progression. And then you see here in figure B, the actual day of burning interpolations that are generated by this. Now, from these, we gathered two metrics: daily area burned, which is simply the area in hectare of each of these day of burning interpolations, and then maximum linear spread. And so what maximum linear spread is a linear distance metric in which we look at the distance from that fire's origin point that day to the furthest point on its perimeter boundary. For the first day of spread, you can see it proliferate out from that origin hotspot all the way to the edge of the boundary. For succeeding days, it's the preceding day's boundary to the end of that individual day's boundary. These were all assessed using a generalized linear mixed effects model in R with a random effect for event ID for every individual fire. So what did we find based on the comparison of our spread metrics to the percentage of land cover within these days? Is we found that aspen did slow fire generally across the landscape, and in quite a dramatic manner as well. If you look at this first plot on the left, we're looking at daily area burn in hectares compared to aspen cover, and the second plot being the maximum linear spread compared to aspen cover, once again showing that as aspen cover increases, we have a decrease in both of our fire spread metrics. To give a little bit more detail here, if you look at some buckets of the percent aspen within these days, you can see how we are having a decline in both of these spread metrics. Now, in all of this modeling, we did find that fire weather, topography, and climate are very influential on these fire spread metrics themselves, but we did not find an interaction between climate and weather and aspen. Thus, we don't believe it was, in this sense, modulated by climate or by fire or climate and weather. And so to get into our next part of the analysis, it was looking at the perimeters of fires. And so what we have here in figure A is a fire perimeter with aspen around it. And then we have in figure B, the definition for perimeter and interior. Perimeter is a 60-meter buffer on either side of the MTBS fire perimeters we're using. We did this to account 2 pixels of land cover on either side of that perimeter, a bit for spatial variation and a bit to also look into those interior types that were burned over that may have contributed to the fire stopping. What this allowed us to gather was the perimeter and interior proportion, the percentage of whatever cover type in each of these spatial classes. With these proportions, we created the fire perimeter effect, which we define as the perimeter in proportion, percent aspen in the perimeter, or another land cover type, minus the interior proportion divided by the perimeter proportion plus the interior proportion. We did this to gather a normal distribution between -1 and 1 for statistical analysis. And in this sense, any value less than 0 is going to be more frequent in the interior of a fire, and any value greater than 0 is going to be more frequent in the perimeter of a fire. We analyzed these using a sign test in which we assess the negative or positive difference. Negative difference less than 1, positive difference greater than 1, of the number of those events across all 453 fires. We then evaluated the summary of those differences, counting them all up with an exact binomial test, and that allowed us to infer what land cover types were statistically significantly more likely to be on a fire perimeter versus a burn interior. The results of that showed us that aspen is 51% more common on fire perimeters. thus for us emphasizing that it is acting as a fuel break in many instances, with a similar size effect to that of wetlands and woodland types. And then you can see here what we're depicting is our fire perimeter effect compared to each of our land cover types, showing warm conifer, what we would expect to be interior as an internal or interior type, and then these other types, aspen being highlighted here in gold as perimeter dominant. You'll notice land cover types such as prior burn or disturbed, where there's limited flora to be burned, generally have the strongest effect in stopping fire in this case. We did find that our fire perimeter effect was modulated by the day of the year, which for us emphasizes a potential phenologic mechanism that modulates flammability. What that likely would be is leaf presence or green up. And so before you have leaf flush and before all of the understory foliage becomes green and has a lot of water in the year, aspen are more flammable and less likely to stop fire in this case. But after leaves have flushed and you have abundant foliar moisture in the understory, this effect becomes stronger, especially in the later summer when other fuels types are likely drying out, while aspen maintains its foliar moisture through the year. So to sum everything up, we found that aspen strongly reduce fire growth rates, and they are also far more common on fire perimeters. Thus, for us, emphasizing that they impede fire spread and in some cases can act to stop fire. This has many different implications, but the two major ones that we are keenly interested in is how an increased abundance of aspen due to type conversion from conifer species, which we'll hear a bit more about in Rachel's panel, could lead to a negative feedback in which you have more of a limited flammability species such as aspen that could dampen the effects of future burning, which in this sense could slow fire as we are seeing an anticipated increase in burning due to climate change. The next effect is we could direct and we can use this as a source for community protection. This is currently has very limited exposure and is being done in Canada. The Yukon government is starting with this example right here, building Canada's first permanent fire break out of trees. What they're doing is treating 365 hectares of conifer forest mechanically and then planting limited flammability species such as aspen in their place. The intent here being to remove the flammable matrix around communities and place a tree species that could help to stop fire before it reaches communities, with other benefits such as increased albedo, increased wildlife habitat, water retention, and of course the aesthetics of aspen trees. So these are major implications of these findings, and we hope to continue this work in other regions. I want to quickly acknowledge the Southwest Climate Adaptation Center, the Bureau of Land Management, of course, Western Colorado University, and the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. They were all sponsors of this program. And I would also like to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Jonathan Koop, all of my committee members who have helped with this research, and the wonderful friends and family who have allowed me to be here. So thank you all very much.
Well done, Matt. We have a couple of questions here. What could be the possible ecological impacts or pros and cons of planting more aspen into forests?
Yeah, it can go a few different ways. And so one of the big highlights and keys for me with aspen is that it is the most biodiverse ecosystem and forest type that we have in Colorado, besides wetlands. And so it supports a ton of wildlife. It has incredible principles for water retention, and it has a lot of benefits to what we would call ecosystem services. And so there's the ability for us to direct and use this in a very active sense in management, especially because aspen are clonal propagators that through intentional disturbance will prolifically propagate into burned areas, into areas mechanically treated, et cetera. So we might be able to drive these things around the landscape and increase their prevalence, which could lead to an increase in all of those mentioned ecosystem services. Now, on the same lens, aspen are a very short-lived species, and their life cycle is rather dynamic. And so this may not be necessarily a very long-term solution. This could be something that may even aid in bringing in another generation of conifer forests due to allowing for better microclimatic conditions, et cetera. And so there's a lot of variance when we're improving or increasing the prevalence of aspen, but generally it might help to slow fire spread. It may bring more heterogeneity to a landscape that is lacking it due to fire suppression, and it also has critical elements for wildlife, water, etc.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I think we're going to move to the next speaker and allow more time for questions to be submitted. So let's give one more round of applause and welcome Rachel to the stage.
All right, hi folks. I am going to be talking about the fauna portion of this section. So specifically how fire-mediated changes to vegetation structure and composition influence bird communities and pinyon juniper ecosystems. So PJ ecosystems, which is what I'll be referring to them as throughout this talk, are just one example of a habitat type in the West that has evolved alongside fire, but that faces contemporary stressors under novel or new climate projections. And so when I talk about PJ ecosystems broadly, I'm talking about anything from PJ woodland to PJ savanna, so long as one of these two species are present. So historically, when thinking about PJ woodlands, they have experienced a really long fire return interval with really high severity stand replacing fires. And when I say long fire return interval, I mean like 200 to 400 years. So really infrequent, but very severe. These days, we're seeing, especially across the Colorado Plateau, some repeat fires outside of that normal fire return interval. And oops, I gave it away. In the aftermath of large disturbance types like fire, we are seeing a overwhelming lack of PJ regeneration. And so this kind of raises the question, as I introduced earlier, this idea of type conversion. So we want to know if type conversion is happening in PJ ecosystems because they serve as a habitat for lots of different wildlife, but especially birds. So over 70 different species of birds breed in PJ ecosystems, many of which are obligate or semi-obligate species. And so we really just want to know what we can expect in terms of habitat type moving forward with more fire in the landscape and how these species might be responding. So that kind of leads me to the overarching question for this talk, which is how do fire-mediated changes in vegetation structure and composition affect PJ bird communities? Moving on to our methods. So we conducted 545 different point count surveys in the summers of 2022 and 2023. And this work was done on the Mesa Verde Cuesta, which is in southwestern Colorado. This area includes Mesa Verde National Park, which is outlined here in black. And then we also surveyed on the BLM lands to the north of the park, as well as on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation to the south of the park. And the reason why we're interested in this area is because it's interesting as a case study. Mesa Verde, since its establishment in 1906, over 70% of the park has burned. And so this is a huge area, as you can see, with these fire perimeters. And so much of that area that burned was PJ woodland. And now if you go there, you see lots of deciduous shrubland types in these fire perimeters, and then also lots of grassland as well. And so this is kind of why we're interested in this area. We sampled a pretty diverse range of habitat types, as well as time since fire, and some unburned landscapes as well. So when I say PJ ecosystems, this is kind of the variation in what I'm talking about there. Next, we extracted 5 different metrics of vegetation structure from discrete return aerial LiDAR data. And then we also used Landsat 8 satellite imagery to quantify deciduousness. And so again, we're really interested in deciduousness because it's kind of knowing where deciduous shrubs exist on the landscape tells us where PJ, isn't anymore in the aftermath of fire. And so we can really track those areas where type conversion may or may not be progressing. And then obviously the last thing we wanted to know was whether or not a survey location had burned. And so we used fire perimeter polygons downloaded from the NTBS dataset to determine the fire history at a particular survey location. And if an area had experienced fire, we then calculated time since fire as well. All right, so I'm not going to talk about Bayesian statistics too much, but just to give you an idea of our analysis, we used a Bayesian hierarchical model to quantify bird habitat associations across burned and unburned PJ landscapes. And what I will say about the utility of this model and the usefulness when working with point count data is that it incorporates two common components of imperfect detection. So those are availability and perceptibility. So, imagine you go out birding and you don't hear a bird and you don't see a bird, but that doesn't mean that birds aren't there. So this type of model is really useful when looking at point count data, especially as it relates to birds. The covariates that we included in our model are those that relate to habitat structure, composition, and then fire history. So from the LiDAR data, we extracted a metric of canopy cover, and then we also quantified vegetation height, and that's trees above the 95th percentile in our study area. So that represents really tall trees in the landscape. Then, like I mentioned, we also included a metric of deciduousness, and we calculated deciduousness by subtracting winter NDVI from summer NDVI. And again, that was from the Landsat imagery. And then we included a metric of burned or not, as well as time since fire in this abundance model. So we modeled abundance for 15 different species that we anticipated would be associated with burned and unburned PJ habitats. So the species that we included, here's a list of them. This is not an exhaustive list. If you're a bird person, you might be wondering why Pinyon Jay is not on here. We should talk about that after. But we basically needed a sufficient number of detections to model abundance for those species. So this is what we got. We have 12 PJ woodland or shrubland associated species, and then 3 species that were associated with oak shrubland, again, that like post-fire successional pathway. So we included in our model over 5,000 detections from those point count surveys of those species of interest. This is a plot that essentially just shows the relationships between each species and the covariates that we included in our model. I'm not going to get into it in this figure too much, but just to unpack it a little bit, we saw supported responses to all of the covariates that we included in our model, and only 2 bird species showed no supported responses at all. And a supported response too, if you're looking at this figure and you're interested, is we have the mean abundance for each species represented by the point, and then we have the horizontal line coming off of that point, which shows the 90% Bayesian credible interval. So if that interval does not cross 0, that shows a supported response. All right, moving on from that figure to get into kind of the meat of the key findings here. The first is that fire decreased the abundance of 50% of PJ associated bird species. This result in and of itself is not necessarily surprising. You might imagine that as a fire kind of moves through the landscape, a lot of habitat requirements for species are lost immediately following that fire. So just to give an idea of what that might look like, so all of these species here shown on the screen are insectivores. And so it's been found that pinyon pines support a really high abundance of arthropods. And so if a pinyon pine burns and is then removed pretty much entirely from the landscape, obviously these species are going to be affected for their foraging tendencies. The next result that is pretty key, and this one is kind of surprising, is that many PJ birds increased in abundance alongside time since fire. So our understanding of this is kind of really hinges on the post-fire successional trajectory. So I'll give an example. We have Woodhouse's scrub jay here, which is a ground forager. And so you might imagine that, an increase in open ground and less canopy cover might benefit this species for its foraging habits. Meanwhile, we have other species like Buick's wren, which is a secondary cavity nester. And so you can imagine time since fire and succession kind of unfolding, and primary cavity nesters coming through, woodpeckers come, use the post-fire environment. And then as time since fire progresses, you might see this species kind of come in and use that post-fire landscape as it needs to. This is also the case for gray vireo, which is nests in kind of low shrubby vegetation. And so if you imagine a post-fire landscape that has more shrubs that increase after fire, this might benefit this species. And so you might expect to see it as time since fire unfolds. And so this is kind of inherently at first glance a positive result. It seems like a positive result. But I do want to just leave you with a couple important caveats here, because this result hinges on like what the post-fire landscape looks like. So the major point here is that post-fire landscapes are largely influenced by climate change, as well as invasive species. So I wanted to include these photos here because they're pretty striking to me, and I think they do a really good job at exemplifying kind of like two different post-fire paths. So both of these areas we included in our surveys, but they both burned 14 years ago. So the same amount of time since fire. But obviously they look really different. The first photo on top is dominated by cheatgrass, which is a non-native species. And then you kind of see just overall a lot lower structural and ecological heterogeneity in this landscape. Meanwhile, the photo on the bottom shows rabbit brush in the foreground, which is a native shrub. And then there's a lot of, mostly all native grasses in this photo. If you look really closely, you can see cheatgrass. But you see like overall higher structural and ecological heterogeneity in a landscape like this. Another thing to note is that cheatgrass can also facilitate increased repeat fire, while nurse shrubs like rabbit brush can facilitate recruitment of PJ seedlings and saplings. And so it's not hard to imagine that you might see different bird community compositions tied to these two areas. So this all is to say that, we might see an increase in some species with time since fire, but it really depends on what the post-fire landscape looks like. Moving on to some management implications, kind of at the more species-specific level. So the first point is that we should really kind of keep an eye out for the species that decreased with burned habitat, but showed no supported responses to time since fire, like juniper titmouse and gray flycatcher. Similarly, we have this species here, Plumbeus vireo, that not only decreased in burned habitat, but also decreased alongside time since fire. So kind of looking at these species response patterns, they become kind of priority species in terms of the ones that might be the most vulnerable if type conversion does occur and we don't see the return of PJ woodlands. Another point is that the post-fire vegetation structure and composition, as I kind of alluded to in the last slide, really matters, especially for species like black-throated gray warbler. So for this species, we saw decreases in burned habitat, increases with time since fire, but a decrease with deciduousness. So that tells me that this species is responding to something other than the increase in deciduous shrubs in the post-fire landscape. So it really depends kind of like what those landscapes look like for this species, as well as a couple others that we looked at. All right, just to close things up with a couple different management recommendations that are based on those patterns and the relationships that we saw to other habitat structural elements as well. So the first is that, we did see a lot of supported responses across the board to things like canopy cover and tree height as well. And so this implies that a complete loss of vegetation structure and kind of, mature trees and those elements of the habitat aren't going to benefit probably most bird species that we looked at. And so one way to mediate these negative effects is to promote the presence of refugia, which Jess kind of outlined, but it's basically these unburned areas where these species might be able to kind of take refuge in the event of a fire. The next point is that in areas that do seem suitable for PJ regeneration, again, this is dependent upon climate and some other variables, but we can promote targeted regeneration by reseeding with some native shrubs. This also might help other species that, use shrubs for part of their life histories as well. And then the last is that a lot of work has been done to kind of identify where areas that are most vulnerable to invasive species invasion are across this landscape. And so these conservation efforts should really be targeted and should be informed by kind of these sorts of maps, like this one that came out in 2015. So I'll leave you with three main points here. The first is that following these really kind of repeat anomalous fire events, some PJ birds are developing or demonstrating ecological resilience, but some should be prioritized for conservation. The second point is that vegetation structure is still important for a lot of bird species, and a complete conversion from PJ woodland to a non-native grassland would not benefit PJ birds or oak shrubland species alike. And then the last point is that, you know, as my panel mates mentioned, we're only going to see increases in frequency and severity of fire. And so it's really important to kind of stay one step ahead. And so this work serves as a case study on the Mesa Verde Cuesta in PJ woodlands, but really this type of work can be used across any habitat type so long as people are looking at birds there. So yeah, it's really applicable anywhere and could be useful. Yeah, thanks to my committee, thanks to my funding sources, thanks to the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe for allowing me to conduct surveys, and I'll take any questions.
Well done. Okay, here's a question for you. I think you touched on this, but we'll ask you to expand. Did you find a trend in the characteristics of those species that are most negatively affected by the aftermath of fire?
The species that, yeah, so most of the species that decreased in burned habitat showed strong responses to canopy cover and like those kind of structural elements that are tied to intact old growth PJ woodland, like canopy cover and tree height. So you could think that those species like those elements of the landscape, which isn't, you know, necessarily new, but those things that are like directly affected by fire immediately after that decrease are kind of what we think they might be responding to.
Great. Here's one more for you. We're seeing a spread of juniper range in places such as the Great Basin. How do you see fires, either their suppression or their growth, impacting the spread of juniper?
Yeah, so that's a huge management question. PJ encroachment on adjacent sagebrush habitat. From my understanding, a lot of this is because of fire suppression in these areas. So you're seeing these really dense PJ woodlands that are encroaching upon adjacent habitats because fire has been suppressed from these areas for so long. And this is a major concern because it obviously affects habitat for other species and rangeland as well. So if it were up to me, I would say bring fire back and you'll see less encroachment on adjacent areas. These PJ woodlands experience stand replacing fires naturally. And so, you know, if you see a complete, like a fire comes in and like completely wipes out a PJ woodland stand, that's like a regulatory factor that ultimately could prevent encroachment. So I would say burn it.
Okay.
Because it'll come back, you know, it's like that's like the natural. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. One more round of applause, please. Okay, we're going to shift gears and direct some questions to all of the individuals on the stage or the group at large. And I'll kick that off with a question for Dagny. What excited you most about your findings? And what do you think are the most promising management or policy implications of your findings?
I would say that's still to be decided. Um, yeah, so there's a lot still to sort through with this project. I have data obviously that I didn't show today, but it's like mean fire interval, time since last fire, from the ground, from the field work I did, and a bunch of like species counts by live and dead tree. There was a bunch of stuff that I didn't include intentionally because it's not fully analyzed yet. So to answer that question, I'd say come to my defense when it's happening and you will have the answer.
All right, we'll stay tuned. That's fair. Okay, let's turn to Jess. Do you anticipate an increase in the need for human intervention to help ecosystems recover after extreme fire events, or should we leave them alone?
Yeah, I would say the evidence is kind of mixed. Like, for example, Matt and I got to go on a really cool field trip last year to the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire footprint. That was a for those of y'all that don't know or aren't aware, the largest recorded fire in New Mexico state history. It consumed like 350,000 acres, I think. And on the field trip, talking to a gal, Andy Thode, she kind of remarked that restoring these high severity areas through manual reseeding, the evidence is like not totally there in the research. But then we talked to some other folks that are doing some really cool work at New Mexico Highlands University. Yeah, out in Las Vegas, who are actually seeing like a good amount of success. And we even got to visit a greenhouse of a gal who is really prioritizing the reseeding of some of these areas. And so yeah, I would say it kind of depends, but kind of going back to like my last couple of slides, like we will have to get really creative in the face of rapid environmental change, these increases in these events and these increases in these high severity areas. So I think that's a really pertinent research question to be explored further.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's a question for the entire group. You don't have to respond, but it's available to you. If I can find it, where'd it go? For all of you, were any of your results surprising or contrary to what you found in the literature?
Yeah, I was surprised that over half of PJ birds didn't just leave when PJ didn't come back. I mean, right now, it's kind of remains to be seen whether or not PJ will return to these bird areas because succession takes a really long time in PJ woodlands. But I feel like my just pessimistic climate change is ruining everything kind of view. Was like, oh, the PJ birds are going to be gone because there's no PJ left in Mesa Verde. But they weren't all gone. So that was kind of obviously I touched on some caveats, but that was surprising and hopeful for me.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Yeah, so my findings definitely went along with what our expectation would be from the literature and from observation from managers. But I think it was still surprising, certainly, because when you think about aspen, at least compared to the sea of coniferous forests that we have here in the Southwest, they're not a very large component. And so that's a lot of the rationale for why we think this hasn't really been quantified or looked into at a broader extent before, is because they are such a small piece in this puzzle. And so it was really cool to see when we're looking at a broad scale across this entire landscape that these small pockets of aspen or continuous forest, whether that's along a stream or in a prior burn, were still very influential when we're looking at the magnitude of this entire area, though they are rather spatially discrete.
Thank you. Here's another question for the entire panel. Do we place too much emphasis on forest ecosystems in these studies or in conservation efforts? To expand on that question, how important are other ecosystem types to fire regime?
I'll start with that one and pass it on. I think there's certainly an emphasis on forested systems when we talk fire. I think that's where we see a lot of the most dramatic effects. It's what we think about a lot of times in those different cases, but fire occurs in many ecosystems. I mean, from tundra ecosystems all the way into the Arctic, savannas, grasslands, etc. So it's an important factor in all of those different ways. I think we as humans oftentimes go to forests because that's kind of what we key in. Those are a lot of the ecological values that we end up caring about. And those are also some of the more severe effects that we see. Or maybe it's because these are the systems that we wish to live in many senses. We're in the WUI, we're making our houses out in the forest. And when those begin to burn down, we're a little more afraid to that regard. I'll pass that on to other panels.
Yeah, I guess I could just reiterate that, forests are really crucial ecologically, economically, and culturally. So I think we do spend a lot of time thinking about fire effects in those systems, but it is important to still explore other fire effects in other ecosystems like grasslands. Like I'm originally from Austin, Texas, and like seeing the crazy fires that happened in the Panhandle just a couple months ago. And those fires, to my understanding, are definitely like climate influenced. still definitely requires a lot of research, especially thinking about like, ecosystems like grasslands still sequester a lot of carbon. There's a lot to be said for other ecotypes to kind of like tease out some of these questions. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do some of that in the future.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more. I'm going to go back to Rachel here. I know you said to table this question, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. What about pinyon jays?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That was actually, I wanted someone to ask me about pinyon jays because I was so bummed that I couldn't include them. So like I said, there was kind of a detection threshold that we needed to achieve model convergence for our analysis. And that was about like 60 observations of whatever species. And we only saw about 33 pinyon jays across both 2022 and 2023. We think there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that, well, so we also couldn't include flyover birds. And so pinyon jays have a huge home range. They're always being super loud, flying overhead, but that doesn't really tell you how they're engaging with the habitat type. So that's why we exclude flyovers. But even still, we didn't see a lot of them. And this is maybe because there's not a lot of pinyon pine left in Mesa Verde. This area, if you go there, there's like grasslands and areas that have burned. There's gamble oak. There's some pinyon pine in like the valleys and stuff, but we can't make a statistically supported inference, but it could be that we didn't see this bird because there's not a lot of its like habitat requirement in the area that we had the most amount of points.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And our last question is, I'm going to bring it back to Dagny. Can you repeat which types of stands were the oldest of your samples? And what do you think will happen if fire does find its way into those older stands?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the maximum age was highest in the continuous dense conifer class. And that is the really super dense Engelmann spruce stands. Interestingly, those also came out as half dead. So basically, if we see a fire in there, right, that's going to be one of those high intensity stand replacing fires, which is characteristic of those spruce forests. So yeah, in terms of average and maximum, it was the continuous dense conifer class. Some of those low elevation open conifer ponderosa pines were also really old, but the understories and the density in those obviously were completely different. So fire just moves throughout that in terms of surface fire.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Well, I learned a ton. Let's give this panel a hand. Well done, everybody. We're super proud of what you've accomplished and shared here today. If you're in the audience and I did not get to your question, my apologies, but I encourage you to talk with these folks on break. We will be returning for the next panel at 1:15. So thanks everyone for being here this morning. We'll see you at 1:15.